I literally couldn't find anywhere else in the video to put this, but I can't wholeheartedly skip it either, so I'm gonna go over it now. I suppose some might consider this a spoiler here, but honestly, who cares? There's a scene in the movie where the protagonist, Thomas, drinks something sketchy, goes into a club, and winds up kissing one of the female characters. Skip to perhaps 30 minutes later, where she reveals how her brother is dead and that Thomas reminds her of him, and the movie never seems to even remotely be aware of just how wrong that sounds. Like, what? Ew. You can probably tell why that was difficult to squeeze into the review. And here we are back in the wonderful world of young adult adaptations. You know, for what it's worth, besides its climax, I'd probably say that The Maze Runner really was the best of this genre that we'd gotten. It had decent action, the characters were proactive, refreshingly so, the acting was solid, the allegories at play were downright subtle compared to the likes of Divergent or the Hunger Games, and the mystery of just why these kids were there and what lied beyond their surroundings was just interesting enough to be worthy of some reasonable investment. Seriously, shame about that ending. A lot of people have their own personal issues with these films, but for me, arguably, the most frustrating thing about them tends to be how awkwardly structured and boring they are. The uninspired exposition sequences seem to never end, and because there's such little story to be dealt with, it always takes forever for the ultimate hook of the film, as far as characters making choices or something interesting finally happening goes, to get underway. In the Hunger Games, the tournament doesn't actually start until we've sat through a good hour of bleak, dull, build-up, and ultimately uninteresting world establishment, and Divergent I don't think ever gets any kind of momentum going. But the Maze Runner franchise? Well, in simplest terms, it doesn't fuck about. In the first film, once the main character Thomas has just enough facts to be able to run into the maze and have us understand the high stakes involved in doing so, guess what? That's exactly what happens. The Scorch Trials is no different, to the point where it almost feels as if it's on the same page as us, the audience. It knows that we only really showed up for teenagers running for their lives and narrowly avoiding getting squished or bitten or caught or shot or whatever, and not any of the teenage romance or the crappy dystopian future material, so it tends to do its best to get all the important information out there as quickly as it can, so it can then jump in with both arms and legs and exciting things can start happening. And irrespective of the many flaws of this series, that is undoubtedly what's making it the most tolerable of the lot, so far at least. And if nothing else, director Wes Ball really does know how to stage and shoot sequences of teenagers running away from stuff as effectively as humanly possible. And if there's one thing that I can say about the two Maze Runner movies that currently exist, neither one of them are actually boring. And when you can turn around and say that you've turned in an entertaining product whilst dealing with a paper-thin narrative like this that's suitable for only one book, yet is inexplicably, half-heartedly stretched out over several, that really is an achievement. Unfortunately, that very positive aforementioned attribute, the whole we know you don't care about this all so let's just move things along as quickly as possible so we can get to these guys running for their lives again thing, then also becomes its biggest problem. The Maze Runner franchise feels as if it's straining so hard to move away from its roots and into being a flat-out action flick, but it ultimately can't because it really is based on a young adult novel adaptation set in a boring dystopian future, as if it's tied to a bungee cord that keeps getting whipped back every time it tries to reach for something more legitimate. So if you're watching to find out whether or not the Scorch Trials outdoes its predecessor, I'm almost inclined to say it's more or less the same shtick, but for very different reasons. It gets so close to being something genuinely good, but feels restrained by its mere existence. It's clearly far more interested in getting us to the next running set piece, and the talent on hand makes the film very much capable of executing those moments well, but it can't ignore the fact that it is an adaptation of a set of books about a bland protagonist and a bland overlong story that has next to nothing new to offer up in the way of actual narrative, besides a very vague, not so subtle undertone about adolescents not doing what the grown-ups tell them to. So while I'll go as far as to say that it's more or less a harmless action thriller with some decent momentum, the Scorch Trials' ultimate issue is that it just doesn't have the story presence to make it anything more than that. Our story being, of course, that we pick up where the last left off. Thomas and the gang have been retrieved from the Maze Trials and are taken into a facility ran by Aidan Gillian as an obvious sleazy bad guy who provides them all with food and clothing and promises to send them all off into new lives in supposed safe havens elsewhere. But shortly after Thomas and a new player named Aris discover they're actually guinea pigs in a test facility to find a cure to the airborne virus that destroyed their world and are still under the surveillance and captivity of WCKD, and yes, that does mean we keep having to ham-fistedly refer to these guys as Wicked the entire time, and that the leader of the organization, Ava, the lady we met at the end of the first film, is still very much alive, Thomas and the gang quickly have to escape the base before truly being put to the test outside in the Scorch. The good news is that description only covers about 30 minutes of the movie. Like I said, they really don't fuck about in these films. In contrast to its siblings of the genre, any possible scenes of tedious filler masquerading as misunderstandings or mystery building seem to be a thing of the past where this film's concerned. The whole thing, once the information is out there, runs at as quick a pace as possible. And the sequence of the group escaping is actually really well executed stuff. Intense, well shot, genuinely funny at times, varied. At one point they're dodging gunfire, at one point they have a hostage, at one point they have their hands on a gun and they're the ones having to shoot their way out. It's competent work and does a swift job of setting the momentum for the rest of the piece. Once the group escape the facility, the story quickly becomes about the team travelling as far as they can to find a rumoured group of freedom fighters known as the Right Arm and meet new allies on their journey. One problem, however, involves victims of the aforementioned airborne virus who... they never quite come out and say they're zombies, but they're zombies, no question about it. The intent this time round seems to be not exactly narrative development as much as world establishment, as once the group make their way out into the real world, it's pretty much like an elaborate road trip. On the one hand, I'd like to give the filmmakers some credit for not just redoing the first film, given how easy it would have been to just stick these characters in another maze and call it a sequel, but still, besides the action scenes, which are very good, I do want to stress that, it basically just amounts to the characters looking around and reacting to stuff the whole time. The story isn't expanded upon as much as the environments are. We learn more about this world, sure, but no one really develops as a character, no big revelations are made, it plays out more like a video game if anything else. The characters keep reaching checkpoints and running to the next location in an episodic fashion, and yet it never truly feels like they're actually going anywhere. And no matter how good you may be at staging those running scenes, if there's no character context outside of bad guys want to find and imprison good guys, the drama just isn't there. The Maze Runner may have had a very simplistic story, but the characters had one central goal: escape the maze. The Scorch Trials, on the other hand, feels more like aimless wandering, which would be fine if the movie weren't so self-serious and it didn't act as if everything that was happening was so important. There are pure action vehicles that offer little in terms of story, but this isn't one of them. It wants me to care about Thomas and Teresa's backstory. It wants me to feel sad when someone dies or when someone gets captured, and I just don't. There are even moments towards the middle half where it almost seems as if Thomas is in denial and might get angry or have an outburst or do something emotionally revealing about his character, and it just never comes to fruition. There are even lines dropped about the death of one character from the last movie fueling his fight, but that character wasn't killed by anyone from Wicked. So who is he angry at and why does he care so much? We need to understand these things. And for a film that spends so much time wandering around in its own setting, you'd think it would have the common courtesy to feature something a little more unique or different from every other dystopian future film. The desert thing's already been done in Mad Max, the zombies are straight out of I Am Legend, hell, there's even a scene where the production design was so generic I was half convinced they were using the same set from Insurgent. And the whole story about the villains and their motives is really poorly fleshed out. I'm still not sure who or what the real threat is, if it's the airborne virus, the zombies, or Wicked. I've already forgotten what the purpose was for putting the teenagers in the maze in the first place, and there's even a scene where one of the bad guys shoots someone in cold blood and then spends the rest of the scene trying to convince people that they're the good guys. Really? Come on guys, that's lazy. But at the same time, I have to spoil some of my criticisms to a degree by saying that it's quite entertaining and Wes Ball is very good in at least salvaging a decent action thriller out of it all. The zombie chase is exciting, heart-pounding stuff, there's a cool change of pace where Thomas and newcomer Brenda are split up from the group and have to make their way through a building on the verge of collapse without falling, whilst legging it for their lives. There are even a few well-composed shots that feel way too competent than what the material's calling for. All in all, The Scorch Trials is a harmless and mostly successful feat in turning in a fine time at the movies out of shoddy material, but that's really all it is. I'm not sure if being the least painful of this genre to endure is a compliment or a criticism, but given how this is based on a series of books, it's pretty damn appalling how a 4-part narrative so far seems to lack so much actual story. Cheers for watching guys, and as always, if you like this video, you can subscribe to my channel.